Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're setting course for a part of the world that covers, well, a huge expanse of ocean, but is often less understood than it should be. Micronesia. We're going to take the source material you've provided, a brief history and some fascinating research papers, and really unpack what they tell us about Micronesia's long, complex journey. When you think about Micronesia, picture this. It's a vast area, roughly, 1.5 million square miles of the Western Pacific, but the land, that's scattered across thousands of islands and atolls, totaling only about 20,000 square miles. So mostly water, really, dotted with land. And as your sources make clear right away, this isn't one simple place. It's incredibly culturally diverse and politically complex. Okay, let's unpack this.
That complexity is absolutely the central thread, running right through its history. These are islands separated by vast distances, each with unique cultures, languages. Then you overlay that with centuries of successive colonial powers, starting with Spain way, way back in 1565, and then the last half century or so administered by the United States. Well, you begin to see why the path towards independence for some of them has been anything but straightforward.
Absolutely. So let's jump right in at the beginning then. The geography and those early societies. We're talking thousands of islands across that million-plus square miles of ocean. And the land itself is diverse too. You've got low-lying coral atolls and then larger volcanic islands with like dramatic mountains and valleys.
Right, and before any European ships showed up, Micronesia was home to just a huge variety of peoples and languages spread across all those different landforms. And it's kind of counterintuitive maybe, but the ocean wasn't just a barrier, it was more like a highway. It served as a major means of communication exchange, leading to a surprising mingling of cultures over time.
How did they manage that? Staying connected across such huge distances in those early times. That sounds like incredible navigation skill.
It really was. The sources talk about these really resilient kinship networks that tied families together, sometimes across hundreds of miles of open ocean.
Wow.
And exchanges weren't always, peaceful, but they definitely happened through negotiation, sometimes through chiefs traveling or via emissaries carrying messages, goods. Just incredible distances. The sources also highlight an economic dynamic. Residents of smaller, maybe outlying islands were often economically dependent on centers of power or islands with more resources.
Right. Resources like fresh water. That must have been a huge factor in how those early societies developed, wasn't it?
Critical. Absolutely critical. The availability of fresh water, the need for defense, that shaped a lot of things, including how social hierarchies developed.
Yeah.
These pre-colonial societies were deeply rooted in local customs, traditions, beliefs. Most areas were matrilineal.
So lineage through the mother's side.
Exactly. Lineage, often inheritance, followed the mother's line, frequently alongside a system involving elder males, mind you. But it wasn't like monolithic. You had islands like Chuck with patriarchal cultures too. It just shows that diversity, even in really fundamental social structures.
That must have made for such a rich cultural tapestry. Each clan having its own myths, legends, songs, dances. And with villages often small and pretty isolated, it totally makes sense why there'd be so much language variety across relatively short distances. How did governance actually work in that kind of scattered, diverse environment?
Yeah, governance was fascinatingly non-centralized for the most part. Very few islands were large enough or populous enough to support truly centralized village federations. Your sources mention some really cool examples like Pohnpei's Sodeler dynasty, ruling from a mountain capital with that incredible, still kind of puzzling stone architecture.
Right, Nan Madol.
Exactly. And then you have the chief of Satawal, whose claim over 7 villages supposedly came from a myth about a sacred chicken.
The sacred chicken, okay.
So power was generally limited, more to chiefdoms based on extended families. Leaders, or sometimes called big men, were often locally elected, maybe, but their influence relied heavily on personal skills trade, war, negotiation, rather than just inherited absolute power. And over time, especially as societies were disrupted or maybe elites died out, chiefs sometimes became more ceremonial figures.
Okay, that gives us a good picture of the world before the big disruption started. Let's transition then to the era of European contact. When did that really start to change things?
Well, sustained contact with Europeans started relatively early. The sources point to the early 1520s. While the very first European arrival might be debated, some islander accounts hint at encounters possibly as early as 1511 or 1512.
But the first documented sightings, those were clearly part of that initial circumnavigation expedition, right? Early 1520s, reaching the Marianas, then the Philippines.
Exactly. And Spain really established a continuous presence from 1565 onwards. Their focus was initially more on the Philippines, but their activity and presence in Micronesia definitely grew over the next 3 centuries.
3 centuries is a long time. Were there other European powers who became players in the region?
Oh, definitely. German interest emerged later on, partly maybe as a way to counter Spanish influence. Germany negotiated a protectorate treaty, basically an agreement offering protection but asserting external control with Spain in 1885 over the Eastern Carolines. There's also rivalry heating up with the U.S., particularly over securing coaling stations for ships.
Refueling spots?
Right. The sources mention a telling incident in 1885 where a German landing party on Yap basically had to pack up and leave when a U.S. cruiser showed up.
Wow, okay. Bit of a standoff.
And Spain eventually sold off the southeastern Carolines, including Truk, which is now Truk, to Germany in 1887. So you started getting this patchwork of claims and interests developing.
Okay, that sets the stage for the European carve-up. How did World War I then change things for Micronesia?
WWI was a massive pivot point, a huge shift. After the war, the League of Nations essentially reassigned control. Japan was awarded the mandate over Micronesia in 1919 or 1920. This meant German assets were seized, and even German missionaries were removed from the territory.
So a completely new administration. What was the Micronesian experience like under this new Japanese mandate?
It was incredibly complex, really full of contradictions. The sources point to deep distrust on one hand, fueled by restrictions, fears about firearms, people disappearing mysteriously, even worries about human experimentation.
That sounds pretty grim.
It does. Yet, paradoxically, some Micronesians apparently perceive the Japanese as more trustworthy, maybe, than the previous administrations in certain ways. It's complex. And despite official restrictions on contact with, say, Americans or other foreigners, trade with the Japanese actually flourished. Strategically, Japan's interest in the islands grew over time, focusing particularly on places like the Marshalls and Trunk Lagoon. Their administration, though, was strict. They interfered with customary practices, demanded a lot of respect, and largely excluded people from majority tribes from any real positions of power. Taxation was enforced by police, and the sources recount a pretty significant incident where a taxation officer was murdered, leading to the imprisonment of local leaders. That created strong anti-Japan sentiment in places like Matupi.
So definite political control being asserted.
Yeah.
What about the economic and cultural impacts during this period?
Well, Japan's perspective on the islands shifted quite dramatically. Initially, they were seen as sort of insignificant outliers, but later they became strategically important, though maybe ultimately seen as expendable as Japan pursued expansion closer to the mainland. This led to a shift towards more remote, sort of indirect control. Economically, Japanese traders established a monopoly, and significant profits accumulated for Japanese licensees, not necessarily for the locals.
Culturally.
Culturally, it was very disruptive. Traditional structures were challenged, sometimes dismantled. A new class of political professionals emerged, which caused significant vexation among the population. The sources note a really interesting cultural response to this. Political folklore, court drama, even just gossip attacking the new elite became popular forms of recreation.
So like a form of resistance.
Almost, yeah. A way of doing folk analysis on power and perceived political incompetence. The Pohnpei House incident involving wealth, rumored curses, a vocal critic, is cited as a classic example of this whole dynamic. This era also, importantly, spurred a desire among Micronesians to document their own history, a way to counter the biased official records, you know?
That's a really powerful consequence, inspiring them to tell their own story. Which brings us, inevitably, to the next major global upheaval, World War II. How prepared was the U.S., for example, to even understand Micronesia before the war really hit home?
According to the sources, not very prepared at all. Before Pearl Harbor, the amount of English language knowledge in the U.S. about Micronesia was, well, minimal. It could supposedly fit into a small pamphlet.
Wow.
The sources do highlight George Peter Murdoch's foresight, though. He immediately assembled experts, the so-called Yale bureaucrats, right after the attack to start compiling whatever information they could find.
And meanwhile, Japan had been busy building up defenses in the islands.
Yes, heavily. From about 1939 onwards, they constructed large, reinforced concrete fortifications. These were designed to withstand intense bombardment. They were concentrated strategically, particularly on the Marianas Islands, and especially Truk, which became a major naval base. They established construction camps on various islets and built bases, airstrips, and really gearing up to support their naval operations.
So what were the key military actions that played out in the region during the war?
Well, the sources describe major events: the Japanese attack on Guam, which surrendered on Christmas Day, 1941, after putting up some defense. But the fate of Micronesia was largely decided by the really fierce U.S. assaults on the Marianas. Truk, which was seen as the supposedly impregnable Japanese stronghold, eventually fell to American forces in June 1944. It then became a key U.S. headquarters and salvage depot. Japanese naval power, of course, had already been severely weakened by earlier crucial engagements like the Battle of the Coral Sea and Midway.
Right. So the islands became absolutely central to the Pacific War effort. What were the direct consequences of all this conflict and the shift in power for the Micronesian people living there?
This is where you see a real disconnect that the sources highlight quite strongly. From an outsider perspective, maybe the U.S. administrators, looking back years later, the post-war political arrangements might have seemed logical, maybe even leading towards eventual financial stability for the Associated States.
Okay.
But for the Micronesians themselves, who had endured this incredible chaos and somehow managed to maintain their cultural identity through it all, well, they were hardly delighted. They faced immediate, very tangible problems. Government officials were dealing with constant complaints about broken infrastructure roads, for example, and disruptions to traditional life, like something called Fisherman's Friday being interrupted.
So day-to-day life severely impacted.
Exactly. And they also experienced internal migration, sometimes forced, and conflict. Like the sources mention, bloody disputes in Kosrae, increasing pressure on land use in Pohnpei, and issues leading to violence right at the Trunk airport. The U.S., understandably from their perspective perhaps, prioritized its own interests. They dismantled the military facilities that had temporarily brought in some wealth and left Micronesia with this immense challenge: how to generate revenue with far fewer resources. Plans were made but often lacked technical support or realistic backing. This led, the sources say, to widespread cynicism about their own newly emerging leaders, questions about competence, integrity, motives.
That sounds like a tough start for self-governance.
Definitely. And here's a key insight from the sources. This imported American idea of democracy didn't necessarily legitimize the new governments in the eyes of the people. Instead, by emphasizing elections and maybe individual choice over traditional authority structures, it often just knocked existing leaders off their pedestals. The focus for voters then shifted, perhaps, to just trying to find someone they felt they could simply trust.
That's a really interesting point about the impact of democracy in that specific context. Okay, so after the war, the U.S. officially takes over administration. Tell us about that post-war period and how it eventually led towards independence for some.
Right. In July 1947, the United Nations designated Micronesia as the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands, or TTPI, placing it under U.S. trusteeship. Initially, this was largely run by the U.S. Navy. And the sources suggest Navy attitudes towards Micronesians varied wildly, from outright condescension to a kind of paternalistic, maybe self-serving affection. It was inconsistent. This period, though, did see the beginning of extensive surveys of the islands and the people, trying to understand what they now administered. This trusteeship relationship lasted for several decades, but it gradually ended for different parts of the territory at different times. The Marshall Islands and the Federated States of Micronesia achieved their new status-free association in late 1986. Palau, however. This whole process required the newly formed island states to rapidly adjust and learn how to govern themselves, often from scratch in some ways.
What were some of the major political steps or developments during this U.S. administration phase?
Changes were introduced gradually. A Western-style education system started to be established around 1957 under the South Pacific Commission initially. A really significant moment highlighted in the statutes was the first official border demarcations that actually cut across traditional ethnic or resource lines in 1964.
That sounds potentially problematic.
It was complex. This seemingly technical process actually prompted the first organized efforts by Micronesians to create written records of their oral histories, a direct response to needing to define themselves in these new political boundaries. The 1970s saw increasing ethno-political activity and tensions. There was a regional uprising mentioned in 1976 and ongoing issues around ethnic separation and identity.
So building towards something.
Exactly. The path to formal independence, or free association for FSM and Marshalls, was an intense 11-year political journey. It culminated in the foundation of the national government structures in late 1974 and 1975. The crucial document defining the post-trusteeship relationship with the U.S., the Compact of Free Association, was signed in 1986 and ratified in 1987. This officially ended the trusteeship for the Federated States of Micronesia, the FSM, in November 1991.
Those formative years must have been incredibly difficult to navigate, filled with so much change.
Absolutely filled with uncertainty. You had long-standing border disputes finally needing formal resolution. You had both planned and unplanned community migrations happening, rapidly changing demographics, a huge increase in the school-age population, which forced the establishment of a public school system basically in 1985. All of this happening alongside the increasing pressures of modernity, plus unexpected political crises and even natural challenges, just a huge amount to deal with.
Were there key figures mentioned in the sources who steered things during this critical time?
Yes, several are highlighted. Presidents like Toshio Nakayama from Pohnpei and John Hagelgum from Chuuk, they partnered in a coalition government navigating those really tough early decisions. Legislative leaders like Nelson N.T. Doy and Redley Killian were instrumental in drafting many of the compact documents. And Chief Justice Edward P.C. King was deeply involved in drafting and defending the new constitution for the FSM. A key point the sources make, which is often missed, is that unlike many other Pacific nations that gained self-determination right after WWII, much of Micronesia didn't. It essentially slipped into what the sources call oblivion for a time, as international attention just focused elsewhere.
Right, out of sight, out of mind for much of the world. So that brings us up to the modern era. What does the political landscape of Micronesia look like today, particularly for the Federated States of Micronesia?
Well, the governing structures often mirror the U.S. model, which is, a direct legacy of the trusteeship period. The Federated States of Micronesia, the FSM, has significant local autonomy within its 4 states. Each state has its own government structure under a federal framework.
Like states within a country.
Exactly. With a bicameral Congress at the federal level, a president, a judiciary, they've adapted components like a presidency that rotates among the states. But the sources point to ongoing challenges, questioning whether the political reforms implemented have really been adequate for the needs. There's a sense, apparently, that central government regions need more services than the current official structure can effectively provide, and that local needs have sometimes been neglected in the bigger federal discussions. There's even a proposed referendum mentioned to expand local government power, but the sources note that because it's kind of mandated without clear accountability mechanisms built in, support for it is actually unlikely.
And that seems tied back to that feeling of disenfranchisement you mentioned earlier, something the sources also highlight, people feeling disconnected from the system.
Precisely. A growing sense, it seems, that the political system isn't fully responsive to the people. Concerns also persist about the true level of independence under the Compact of Free Association with the U.S. There's worry that rapid development, economic development, is outpacing the necessary infrastructure and, importantly, the local checks and balances needed to manage it effectively. So while democratic features like elections, press freedom, and independent judiciary, civil society groups, while those things exist, the perception remains, according to the sources, of a powerful elite tied to resources, a population that feels politically maybe a bit anemic or disempowered, bureaucratic stagnation, and definite concerns about corruption.
Okay. And if we connect this political picture to the economy, what are the main challenges there?
Yeah, the challenges are pretty substantial. The sources describe dramatic economic shifts in the late 20th century, the last 20 years or so, with rapid growth in certain sectors like high-tech fishing, tourism, and food processing. Yet the expected widespread prosperity from that growth hasn't really trickled down to ordinary Micronesians, generally speaking.
Can you give us some specific examples of those economic shifts and maybe why the prosperity hasn't materialized for everyone?
Certainly. For instance, there's been huge growth in fish exports, especially tuna, valued in the hundreds of millions annually, a huge resource. But the sources point out that the joint ventures set up in this sector often seem to involve formerly foreign owners simply returning as joint controllers. That potentially limits the local benefit and control. In food processing, you see modern businesses, sometimes joint ventures, using local brands, which is good. But interestingly, there's also a shift in consumer preference. Noted some people now prefer convenience foods baked off island or instant meals over traditional foods, which obviously impacts local food production and culture.
Amidst all these political and economic challenges, there's also mention in the sources of a cultural renaissance happening. What does that look like?
It's described very much as a work in progress, sort of a rebuilding, a reclaiming. You see it in things like festivals in the northern Mariana Islands. The cultural carnival Janaka are mentioned efforts towards a more confident expression of cultural pride. In Cosray, there are efforts noted to restore respect for the natural order and local resources, trying to bring back traditional ecological knowledge, perhaps, though the sources also note a less cautious, maybe more assertive, approach emerging in some areas, too.
And identity is part of this.
Absolutely. A point about identity the sources bring up regarding the Marshall Islands is quite interesting. While blood quantum needing certain degree of Marshallese heritage, 116th is mentioned as a preference is a recognized criterion for citizenship. Cultural identity itself is seen as equally, if not more, important. So older Marshallese individuals might apply for citizenship based primarily on their strong cultural connection and practice, even if their actual blood quantum is minimal.
That's fascinating. Culture over just ancestry.
Right. And here's a potentially powerful development mentioned. The potential for nationally held institutions to use new technologies, digital archives, databases, to codify, store, and transmit important traditional knowledge. It's a way of adapting modern tech to specifically local cultural ends.
That sounds promising.
It does. However, the sources also include a crucial warning. This renewed cultural pride must be, liberating and inclusive. It shouldn't turn into exclusionary tribalism or demands for political control based solely on group identity. They see this as a real potential danger, referencing some efforts observed in Cosray and Saipan.
A fine line to walk. Turning to the environment now, what specific challenges do the sources highlight in that area? It's mostly ocean after all.
Well, one really specific and perhaps surprising challenge highlighted is aviation safety linked directly to wildlife hazards. Bird strikes, even mammal strikes on island airfields, are apparently quite common and often not effectively mitigated.
Really? Why not?
It creates a difficult dilemma. Often, the species causing the hazards, birds, bats, etc., are locally protected, culturally significant, or part of the ecosystem people want to preserve. So it's safety versus environmental preservation. And while civilian airports have seen improvements, the sources suggest the wildlife impact hasn't been thoroughly addressed across the board. Some certified airfields reportedly lack even basic information or management plans for this specific issue.
That's a unique island problem. And how does Micronesia navigate its place in the broader global context today? They're small islands in a big world.
Yeah, the sources describe Micronesia as small islands, but nevertheless global. They are actively negotiating their future on the world stage, dealing with critical global issues like climate change and sea level rise.
Which must be existential threats for low-lying atolls.
Absolutely. These directly threaten important cultural sites, tourism attractions, even just places people live. This requires careful development of land and water use policies, especially alongside any tourism expansion, and managing vital beach resources, dealing with things like sand dredging, the impact of jetties, beach nourishment projects. They are caught, the sources suggest, in this push for regional and global alliances and exposure, while simultaneously needing to address significant internal fault lines and disparities across the different island groups. The sources introduce this really evocative concept of deep blue within green islands. It emphasizes the vast ocean realm they inhabit, their ocean-centric cultures, and a sense of deep blue resistance, a kind of strength and resilience aggregated within the oceanic depths, within their connection to the sea.
That's a powerful image.
It is. And another interesting global connection mentioned. The anthropological knowledge gathered by the U.S. during the trusteeship period has, in a sense, become the property of Micronesians themselves now. It's a resource they can use to understand their own past and present. Also, the sources note that the nuances of their new political statuses, like the fact the Northern Mariana Islands have more limitations on their autonomy compared to the freely associated states like FSM, remain a major source of worry and negotiation for Micronesian leaders navigating international relations.
Okay, that brings us to thinking about the future. What prospects does the source material point towards?
Well, as of the source's context, the political landscape includes those three independent states in free association with the U.S., that's the FSM, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands, RMI, two U.S. territories, Guam and the Northern Marianas, and one Japanese territory, though the sources don't elaborate much on that last one in this context.
And how does the increasing pace of globalization factor into their future prospects?
Globalization is definitely viewed as a double-edged sword in the sources. On one hand, it increases interdependence, enhances mobility, potentially beneficial for education, trade, connecting families. But on the other hand, it carries this potential to homogenize the world, threatening unique local myths, rights, languages, leading to a sense of, as the sources put it, stolen native pride, a feeling that their distinct identities are being eroded by outside forces.
That makes sense. This source has also touched on the history of youth and education. How does that fit into the future outlook?
Yeah, Western schooling was introduced relatively early during the colonial periods, but challenges like illiteracy persisted for decades. The sources point to various barriers, maybe inadequate teacher training, policy neglect at times, funding not always reaching the schools effectively. Religion also played a significant, sometimes contentious role in education historically. Remember those civil wars mentioned back in the 1880s? Some were apparently spurred by opposition to new religious introductions tied to schooling. So education has always been intertwined with these broader cultural and political shifts.
Right, and technology. You mentioned earlier the sources discuss cell phones playing a surprising role.
Yes, the spread of cell phone use has been quite significant, even by the time of the 2010 census data mentioned. Around 68% of FSM households had cell phones then, and coverage has presumably expanded since. And they're used for very practical coordinating church activities, arranging transport with neighbors, small business owners, checking stock remotely. Useful stuff.
But there was a downside.
There was. The sources highlight a negative consequence. Somewhat ironically, cell phones seem to have exacerbated existing social problems, particularly by making gossip circulate incredibly easily and rapidly. Without the immediate context or ability for counter-asking and clarification that you get in face-to-face interaction, information can be easily misconstrued, distorted as it spreads electronically, moving further and further from whatever the actual ground truth might have been.
Wow, that's a really specific and unexpected downside to modern tech in that context. This has been a truly deep dive. We've journeyed from diverse pre-colonial societies through centuries of these successive colonial rules, the intense upheaval of World War II, the complex path towards independence or free association, and right into the ongoing challenges and unique cultural and environmental dynamics of modern Micronesia.
It's clear Micronesians have faced just immense challenges in coming to terms with the profound, long-lasting impacts of colonialism. The sources are quite clear about the military, economic, and social dominance exerted, particularly highlighted in the post-war division, the source notes between the U.S. and France's approaches elsewhere in the Pacific. Micronesians today are actively engaged in trying to reshape their environments, their narratives. And the sources suggest they are right to seek forms of compensation or reparation for what was taken or damaged over those centuries. A really significant takeaway for me is how Micronesian cultures have demonstrated this incredible resilience, resisting obliteration through sheer perseverance, adaptation. They've maintained sites of culture, social forms, traditions against enormous pressure. Though the sources also intriguingly note that the complexities of the post-1976 era, as independence movements gained steam, exposed some internal conflicts and debates, even within the field of Pacific anthropology itself, as outside scholars grappled with how to understand and represent these legacies.
It really is a story of powerful endurance and adaptation. So considering Micronesia's ongoing efforts, this constant balancing act between their rich traditions and the demands of navigating modern economic and political realities, asserting their identity in this increasingly globalized world, what does this deep dive suggest to you, our listener, about the true meaning of self-determination in the 21st century? Something to think about.